This week it's our final focus on a particular art form, and I'm going to look at photography. So the question is photography an art? Now we're looking at an article by Roger Scruton. It's a very provocative article, as Scruton's articles often tend to be if you know anything about him. He's quite a conservative, right-wing provocateur. Anyway, he's written this article which is quite interesting, I think, because of the challenge that it sets up to photography. Even if you don't agree with it, it's quite interesting to work out what's wrong with it. Okay, so here's his conclusions in this article. The first thing he says is that a photograph, P, of an object is not a representation of that object. And I'll explain why he thinks that in a minute, because he's got a special kind of account of what a representation is. Photography is not a representational art form, he says. A film, as in a movie, if it is a representational artwork, is not an artwork in virtue of any contribution made by the photography. Right, so those are very provocative-looking conclusions. And I'll go through each of them. So here's his first claim: a photograph P of an object O is not a representation of O. And here's how he defines representation. If X represents Y, X expresses a thought about Y. So he's defining representation in a really quite idiosyncratic way that you should notice. He's saying that in order for a representation to represent something, like, it has to express a thought about that thing. Representations could be pictures, could be sets of sentences, could be other things too, but he's saying that there's definitely always expression of thought involved. Now, he introduces the idea of an ideal painting. So he's going to be contrasting photography as an art form, or as a not art form, with painting, which he thinks is a paradigmatic art form, like the ideal. And he has the notion of an ideal painting. An ideal anything captures what's distinctive in that thing and in our interest in it. Okay, so that's his notion of an ideal. And an ideal painting, firstly, stands in an intentional relationship to the object it depicts. What he means by standing in an intentional relationship, it means that the painting represents the painter's perspective on that object, and that perspective could be wrong. So it's the painter's thoughts about the object are conveyed through the medium of paint, so it satisfies the condition he has on it being a representation. But it follows from this that perhaps the object needn't exist at all, or the object, if it does exist, needn't have the properties which it appears to have in the painting. So you could paint something that didn't exist. Basically, any painter could paint something that didn't exist. You could paint a unicorn, you could paint a person that you'd never seen before that doesn't exist. You could just make something up and paint it. Or you could paint something that does exist, but you could paint it very differently to the way it actually is. You could add wings, you could make its hair colour different, you could make its shape different, you can alter any aspect of it you want. That's painting. That's like essential, he thinks, to the medium of painting. So that's what he means partly by standing in a painting, standing in an intentional relationship to the object. There's this freedom for the painter to manipulate the medium to convey their thoughts about the object or about something else. They don't have to just reproduce reality mindlessly. You might see where this is going. Those things, the fact that a painting stands in an intentional relationship to the object, the fact that the painting can represent something that doesn't exist, they make it the case that a painting can express a thought of the painters about the object, and so, strictly speaking, represent that object in the sense he set out in the beginning. It also means that a painting can represent fictional or imaginary objects, and a painting can be assessed in terms of the truth or falsity of what it represents. Like, you can look at a painting and say, yeah, that's very like a particular object, or you can say that's nothing like that object. Okay, so he also thinks that all of these features are relevant to aesthetic value of painting. Like, partly why we aesthetically value a painting is that it differs from we know that there's this gap between what the painting could have represented and the world. So the painter has all this choice, this representational choice. They can do it, make a painting look like that thing or not. It's up to them. Okay, now contrast is photography, obviously. Scruton now has this notion of the ideal photograph. The ideal photograph, he says, stands in a causal relationship to an object, not an intentional one, a causal one, from which it follows that that object must exist and it must have the properties, roughly, which it appears to have in the photograph. So, the model for photography, and Scruton was writing in the 80s, I think, when photography wasn't digital. So, light hits an object, and the light then, the negative in the camera is exposed to the light at a particular point, and an image gets embedded in the negative. So there's this purely causal relationship. The only thing that the photographer had to do was press the button, basically, and then the image was made. So the photographer didn't get to choose how to represent that object particularly, and he didn't get to get any option about, like, a photographer cannot photograph things that don't exist, because you need an object to have this causal relationship with the image, and the object has to exist. So you can't photograph a unicorn, you can paint a unicorn. Now, this has consequences. This, Scruton says, means that a photograph cannot express a thought of the photographer's about the object. And if it can't express thoughts about the object depicted, then it can't be a representation in the sense that he defined. It could be a representation in much looser sense, but it can't express a thought of the photographer's about the object. And it cannot represent fictional or imaginary objects either. And it cannot be assessed in terms of its truth or its falsity, because it's all true, so there's no falsity. So in a sense, you can't give a photograph extra credit for being accurate, because all photographs are accurate, and that's just the nature of the medium. This is, I mean, I'm inhabiting Scruton's position here. You may be disagreeing with it mentally, but this is what he thinks, I think. Okay, and this means Scruton thinks that a photograph can't be aesthetically valuable as a photograph. There are maybe other ways that a photograph could be aesthetically valuable, but its photographic nature cannot be aesthetically valuable, whereas a painting can, because the aesthetic value of the painting derived from the choices that the painter made about what they depicted, how they depict it, where they put the marks, whether they did it accurately or not accurately, whether they did something that existed or didn't exist. And the photographer has no control over any of those elements. They just press the shutter, basically. Now, there's two things you need to read. One of them is Scruton, and another is an article by Kendall Walton, yet another article by Kendall Walton. He's like dominating this module. But he just keeps writing these really well-known articles. So now he has an article which isn't directly arguing for the same conclusion as Scruton, but fits very well with it. It's a bit like Radford and Walton last week. Radford and Walton are not directly arguing for the same thing, but there's obviously an interesting relationship between them both. Okay, so here's Walton's view. He says, we see through photos to their objects. He says that photographs are transparent. Paintings aren't, photographs are. So when you see a photograph of your, dead ancestor, you're seeing through the photograph to your ancestor. You're literally seeing, in some sense, your ancestor. But you don't see through paintings to their subjects. He defines what it is to see something as to have visual experiences of a thing which are caused by that thing in a purely mechanical manner. So, just to elaborate on that a bit, take ordinary seeing. There's a mechanical process going on as your eyes scan the room. Light is hitting your retinas, it's hitting the cones and rods in your eyes, it's being converted into information that's being taken up by your brain, and it's producing the visual field that you now have. None of that is because you chose to make that happen. The only choice you have is to close your eyes or open them, basically, or to move the direction of your eyes. But apart from that, you are not bringing about seeing. Seeing is happening mechanically, like as a process. This, then this, then this, then this, then this. Okay? Walton argues that photography can be seen as a mechanical extension of the seeing process, because there's no sort of intentional interruption from the photographer. So it's a bit like what Scruton's view, that the photographer can't kind of intervene in the process. It's just a purely causal process. Now, paintings, Walton says, are not transparent because, as it says there, your visual experience of a painting and what it depicts is counterfactually dependent on what the artist believed. Right? So the idea is a counterfactual dependence is if the artist's beliefs had been different, the painting would have been different. He's assuming that, I think he's talking about a painting which is painted from life, something like that. So if the artist thinks or believes that there's an orange flower in front of them and they want to do a realist painting, they will paint an orange flower. If they believed there was a pink flower in front of them, they would have painted a pink flower. If they were colourblind and there was a green plant in front of them and they saw it as red, they would have painted something red if they didn't know they were colourblind. So there's a sort of the painter's beliefs, what the painter sees, what the painter believes they see, generally what the painter intends, is a kind of filter between the painting and the world. The painter looks at the world, interprets it, and paints what they interpret. So there's this kind of human intentional presence between the world that's being depicted and the depiction. And if the painter's beliefs about the world had been different, the depiction would have been different. Photos, Walton says, are not like that because it doesn't matter what the photographer believes about the world. They just press the button and the causal process just happens. A colourblind photographer doesn't take a different picture. A photographer who's hallucinating doesn't take a different photograph. They just press the shutter and they take the picture. There's just a mechanical causal process from the minute they press the button to the production of the image. And the image that's produced is not counterfactually dependent on what the photographer believes, it's only counterfactually dependent on what the scene actually looked like. That's the difference. If the scene had been different, the photograph would have been different. It's not if the beliefs of the photographer had been different, the photograph would have been different. So if you take this random picture which I got off the internet, which is just some people spectating at a race. There's various things going on in there that the photographer might not even have noticed. Right? The photographer might not have noticed some of these. They might be looking at their photograph later and go, oh yeah, I just noticed that that guy's holding a Coke can. I didn't notice that when I took the photo. In contrast, you could never get a painter that just happened to find out that they painted a Coke can. Like, the painter will have always intentionally included whatever they included and excluded whatever they excluded. And if a painter paints a guy holding a Coke can, it's because he either believed there was one or that he wanted to depict one. So the scene, the photograph is counterfactually dependent on whatever actually was there. The painting is counterfactually dependent on whatever the painter believed was there, if that's what they were trying to do. Does everyone understand that? Okay? So, this is part of Walton's case for the idea that photographs are transparent. He gives us a slippery slope argument, what's called a slippery slope argument. And in slippery slope arguments can be good or bad. But what they try to do is to push you down, push the person you're trying to persuade of something down a slope that starts with something they accept and then moves them slowly, incrementally to something that they should also accept, because you say, well, there's no relevant difference. There's no relevant difference between each stage of the slope, so you should go down the slope because you're already committed to it effectively. Walton is saying we should extend our notion of seeing because there's no significant difference between the following cases. So he starts with ordinary seeing, like I described earlier, light hitting your retinas, images being produced by your brain, being processed, information being understood. Then imagine putting, or you don't have to imagine some of you, but put on some glasses, some spectacles. Now you're seeing through a lens that has sharpened the image in various ways, but it's still a mechanical process. It's basically just another layer to the mechanics of the whole process. Now think about seeing yourself in a mirror. Now what's happened is that the angle has changed, as it were, and the image has been reversed, but you're still getting lots of visual information about the way you look via an extension of the mechanical process of seeing. There's no intentional manipulation of this at all. Telescopes now allow us to see very far in the distance, as if it were very close up. So now we've got a disruption of the spatial nature of seeing. Like, normally you can only see what's relatively close to you. Telescopes allow us to see things that are very far away, but it's still completely a mechanical process. You just look through it, the lenses magnify the image, and your brain takes up the information. Okay, so now you're being pushed down this slope. Right? You accepted that seeing was mechanical. You could accept that you can see through spectacles. You can see through mirrors. I'm not sure about that, but you can see through telescopes. I've got telescopes twice there. Next is live closed circuit television. There you've got something happening in real time that you're seeing, but it's really a big disruption of the spatial relationship. Just as with telescopes, it could be something that's happening like in another building that you could never normally see, but the process is mechanical. Then from there you move to delayed television broadcasts. Now we've got a disruption of time. So now you're watching something that happened before and is not happening simultaneously with you watching it. So that is a big difference to all the cases we've had so far, possibly with the exception of telescopes, for a reason I'll say in a minute. But still he thinks there's a sense in which you can see through television broadcast to what actually happened. Anyway, and eventually he gets to photographs. So photographs are still Obviously, there's a massive disruption in the time relationship because you can see a photograph of something that happened hundreds of years ago. There's also a disruption in the space relationship because you can see something that happened on the other side of the world in a photograph. You don't have to be near it. And it's obviously not moving. But he thinks if you accepted all those other bits of the slippery slope, why not accept that you can see through photographs? If you think you can see through live closed-circuit television, then you already accept that you can see things that are happening very distant to you. If you think you can see through delayed television broadcasts, you can accept that you think you can see things that are happening in the past. He could also mention stars. So if you look up at a star, there's a sense in which you're seeing something that happened millions, I guess, thousands of years ago, because it's taken the light that long to reach us. So we seem to allow that you can see stars, so why not that you can see your dead ancestors? Okay. So all of that is not a direct argument for Scruton's conclusion, but it does nicely complement it. Because it seems to enhance this difference between the painted medium and the photographic medium, which Walton thinks, well, they both think is purely mechanical. Okay, any questions about any of that so far? Okay, right, now I'm going to go back to Scruton and focus on his second claim, which is photography is not a representational art form. Here's the support he gives for B. A photograph P of an object O is not a representation of O. And remember, that means it cannot convey thoughts about O. He says, a photograph of a dramatic representation is not a photographic representation. So this is anticipating a counterexample. Someone could say, I took a picture which is clearly conveying thoughts about something or other, like a person dressed up in a costume as a mythical character, and then I took a photograph of them. Why isn't that a representation of that character? Now, Scruton says there's dramatic representation going on in that photograph, but it's happening at the level of what was photographed. It's happening at the level of the thing behind the lens, like there's somebody dressed up, there's somebody acting.